One of the most important environmental issues today, some would call it the most important issue, is global warming. Ever since the industrial age began 150 years ago, factories, cities, farms, automobiles, and homes have been pouring carbon dioxide and other waste gases into our atmosphere. Scientists know that these gases contribute to what is known as the greenhouse effect. That is, like the glass in a greenhouse, these gases, along with water vapor and cloud cover, reflect infrared heat back to the Earth and lead to a warming of the Earth's surface. Well, all meteorologists and climatologists agree that there is a greenhouse effect, and indeed this greenhouse effect has been keeping the Earth at a livable temperature for many millions of years. But now come the disagreements. Some meteorologists and climatologists predict that the addition of large amounts of carbon dioxide and other gases from human activities will increase the greenhouse effect and lead to a dramatic rise in average temperatures around the world in the 21st century. This global warming, some warn, may prove to be one of the most catastrophic happenings in human history. In support of this claim, many recent books, articles, TV documentaries, and Hollywood movies have made a doomsday scenario so vivid and believable that polls show the majority of the public now takes global warming for granted. The only disagreement is how hot it will get and what, if anything, we can do about it. Not so well known is that some meteorologists and climatologists disagree with this prediction. These dissenting scientists claim that the evidence today is far too flimsy to support such a scenario. Some of the more colorfully critical ones go so far as to claim that while the greenhouse effect is solid science, global warming is a lot of hot air. And finally, there is also much disagreement as to what actions we should or should not take as a society to mitigate the possible ill effects of a global warming if it does happen. Well, we talk to scientists and environmentalists about these issues to help you begin to investigate the claims for yourself. One of the most aggressive and outspoken proponents of the global warming scenario, and of ways to counter it, is the environmentalist Jeremy Rifkin, president of the Foundation on Economic Trends. His is a common view, and here it is.
I think we have to realize that global warming is the bill come due for the industrial age. All of the spent molecules of carbon dioxide and methane and CFCs and nitrous oxide, that is the remains of our profligate consumption lifestyle, especially in the first world. The fact is, the United States are the main contributors to global warming. Our U.S. population is also the main users of resources on the planet. 6% of the population on this globe lives in our country. Yet we're using a third of the resources of this earth. And we are responsible for about 28% of global warming. So the beginning point for any discussion on addressing global warming is to change our lifestyles in this country. We need to develop a green lifestyle. We need to change our concepts and relationships to the environment. We have to develop tools that are sustainable to our resource base. We have to realize that the planet is an organism and that we need to treat it with respect and dignity. And finally, we're going to have to learn that the more we consume, the less resources are available on the earth for other human beings and other creatures. So if we want to steward this planet for our children's generation, we're going to have to develop a green lifestyle, a green cultural movement. We're going to have to learn to use our fair share of resources and no more. And we're going to have to learn to be good neighbors in terms of the rest of the planet.
Mr. Rifkin assumes there will indeed be global warming. The next expert we talk to is not so sure. He is Reid Bryson, internationally respected climatologist and author at the University of Wisconsin. What do you think of global warming, Dr. Bryson?
Well, global warming is an interesting and significant hypothesis. but it is no more than a hypothesis. It's based on the fact that carbon dioxide and certain other gases in the atmosphere absorb a lot of heat radiation, infrared radiation from the Earth. And so increasing the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is like adding another blanket to your bed. It keeps the surface of the Earth, as your blanket does you, a little warmer.
If that's true, won't that lead to what people are worried about, global warming?
But that's providing that other things don't happen. If nothing else happened but adding the carbon dioxide, then the Earth would warm. But the characteristic of the climate is that there's always something else that's happening. There's a lot of things that cause the climate to vary, and carbon dioxide content of the air may be one of them. I say maybe because when carbon dioxide increases, we assume nowadays that it's due to human activity. And there's some evidence that the present increase is exacerbated at least by human activity. But carbon dioxide has gone up and down in the past, too. And by past, I mean many thousands of years ago, when those changes could not have been related to industry, for example. 10,000 years ago, for example, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere nearly doubled rather rapidly, following which nothing happened, but preceding which the temperature of the Earth had rapidly risen at the end of the major stage of the Ice Age. Now, that suggests that the rise in carbon dioxide was caused by the warming rather than the carbon dioxide increasing, causing warming. So I, for one, don't believe that the rules of the game change that fast, that now carbon dioxide is a cause, and in the past it was an effect. And I believe that causes usually precede effects.
We visited NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, where climatologists gather data from weather stations around the world, combine it with historical data on weather and climate in past years and ages, and then use some of the world's most powerful computers to analyze this data. Dr. Stephen Schneider, author of the popular book Global Warming, and one of the world's leading promoters of global warming scenarios, used to work here. He and his colleagues have been testing various world climate scenarios on their high-speed computers over past decades. In the 1960s and 70s, their modeling suggested the world was going to get colder, even enter into a little ice age in the next century. But beginning in the 1980s, the results from this modeling changed and now consistently seem to point to serious warming trends in the 21st century. While the average worldwide temperatures have only risen 0.5 degree centigrade in the 20th century, their models predict that average temperatures worldwide will increase from 2 degrees centigrade in the most optimistic scenario to 8 to 10 degrees centigrade in the most gloomy scenarios. Similar computer simulations using similar climate models have been carried out in other climate research laboratories around the world, and the conclusions are similar. Unless something dramatic is done to slow and eventually to stop the accumulation of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, the world is in for significant global warming, and probably sooner rather than later. Well, such a dramatic rise in warming would lead to unknown but potentially catastrophic changes in countries around the world. Coastal cities might be flooded. Some islands might simply disappear. Rain patterns would be changed, with some areas becoming wetter, others turning into deserts. Hurricanes and other violent weather storms would become more common, and many plant and animal species would become extinct. And then if melting ice at the North and South poles should flood too much fresh water into the ocean, ocean currents and prevailing winds could change, making Europe a Siberian wasteland and North Africa a temperate grassland. It is even possible, like the popular movie The Day After Tomorrow, that the changing ocean currents could trigger a new ice age instead of a global warming. This global warming hypothesis, as Dr. Bryson calls it, should, like all scientific hypotheses, be subject to test and debate before being accepted as reliable theory and the basis for societal action. Some of the global warming specialists, however, like Dr. Schneider, believe so strongly in their models and in the seriousness of the situation that they have suggested we need to shortcut this procedure. On the one hand, wrote Dr. Schneider, as scientists, we are ethically bound to the scientific methods, in effect promising to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but, which means that we must include all the doubts, the caveats, the ifs, ands, and buts. On the other hand, we are not just scientists, but human beings as well. And like most people, we'd like to see the world a better place, which in this context translates into our working to reduce the risk of potentially disastrous climatic changes. To do this, we need to get some broad-based support to capture the public's imagination, and that, of course, entails getting loads of media coverage. So we have to offer up scary scenarios, make simplified, dramatic statements, and make little mention of any doubts we might have. Well, in 2001, the National Academy of Sciences released a report on climate change, prepared in response to a request from the White House. Many of Dr. Schneider's colleagues were on the panel of 11 scientists who wrote the report, which received wide press coverage and concluded that indeed global warming was real. Temperatures are in fact rising. One of the 11 scientists on the panel was a critic of the global warming hypothesis, Dr. Richard Lindzen, climatologist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. While he endorsed the final report, he pointed out later that the report has been much misinterpreted in the press. He wrote, "Our primary conclusion was that despite some knowledge and agreement, the science is by no means settled. We are quite confident, one, that global mean temperature is about 1/2 degrees Celsius higher than it was a century ago. 2, that atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide have risen over the past 2 centuries. And 3, that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas whose increase is likely to warm the Earth, one of many, the most important being water vapor and cloud. But, and I cannot stress this enough, we are not in a position to confidently attribute past climate changes to carbon dioxide or to forecast what the climate will be in the future." Well, we interviewed Dr. Lindzen in his MIT office a few years before the conference when he expanded on his critique of the global warming scenario.
As far as the scenario goes, there are things we're aware of, that certain gases have been increasing. The question has been, can we readily expect these to lead to significant warming? As far as I can tell, the evidence of the past, which is to say the last 100 years, when we've already increased greenhouse substances, or I should better say minor greenhouse substances. Certainly the most important is water vapor. The next most important is water in cloud form. The gases like carbon dioxide and methane are distant thirds and fourths. And they have increased significantly over the last century. And if the current models were right, we should already have seen approximately 1 degree temperature rise over the last century. It's arguable as to whether we've even seen a 1/2 degree, And it is even more arguable whether we could associate that half degree with carbon dioxide, since it almost all occurred by 1940. So I would argue that what we have seen so far tells us our models are wrong and are greatly overestimating what CO2 will do in the future. If you ask that the models be consistent with what we have seen so far, it's saying by the end of the next century, we will see less than a degree warming.
Well, should we then, we asked Dr. Linson, try to cut back on our carbon dioxide emissions?
Certainly, I wouldn't recommend very much in connection with warming, for two reasons, of course. One, personally, I don't think what we're doing for the foreseeable future will give rise to warming. And so from that point of view, anything we do will not be terribly effective. But second of all, even by some of the worst case models, most of the proposed actions would do nothing for warming in those models. Indeed, this has been recognized to the extent that in this intergovernmental panel that is supposedly reviewing the warming problem, they have concluded that we will have to cut back CO2 emissions by 60%. Now, it is true, eventually when you get to that level of change, which is incredible, I mean, it would be in the trillions and trillions of dollars. I mean, our OMB estimated trillions of dollars for a 20% reduction. 60% is astounding. I can't believe that that number is put forth as anything but a statement of what would be needed and what can't be done. And so if we're talking about small changes in efficiency, they're not going to do anything.
As you can see, not all scientists agree about global warming. Similarly, there is much disagreement about steps to take to avoid possible warming. For instance, Amory Lovins, director of the Rocky Mountain Institute in Snowmass, Colorado, would strongly disagree with that last statement of Richard Linson. Dr. Lovins explained just why he thinks efficiency is an important answer to global warming, as well as other resource and environmental problems.
Well, if we use energy in an economically efficient way, it's cheaper not to burn those fuels in the first place. And I think we will find a lot of scope for abating global warming and saving money at the same time, because it's cheaper to use efficiency than to buy the fuels.
But doesn't that imply, as Jeremy Rifkin has said many times, a curtailed green lifestyle where we don't use so many resources and so much energy?
Not at all. I'm talking about energy efficiency. And I don't use the term energy conservation because to about a third of Americans it means privation, discomfort, curtailment, doing without. What I'm talking about is doing more with less by using the energy in a smarter way that saves money. You might think of the way we use energy as being like the person who can't keep a bathtub full of hot water because the water keeps running out. Well, there are three things you can do about that. You can get a bigger water heater, which tends to cost a lot and still doesn't really solve the problem. Or you can give up bathing and just take sponge baths and be uncomfortable and smelly. Or you can get a plug. Now, what I'm talking about is plugs. They're simple and cheap, and they're evolving very quickly. In fact, most of the best ways we have now to save electricity were not on the market a year ago, and the same was true a year ago. 5 years ago, I could only tell you that it's cheaper to save electricity most of the time than to build and run new power stations. But now I can tell you it's generally cheaper to save electricity than to operate existing power stations, let alone having to build them. And I think we will find a lot of scope for abating global warming and saving money at the same time, because it's cheaper to use efficiency than to buy the fuels. Similarly, there's a lot of concern, correctly, about acid rain, much of which comes, for example, out of power plants and a lot of the rest from cars. Well, the normal solution proposed to this is to raise your electric bill to put diapers on the dirty coal-fired power plants. But another way to do it is to use methods that many utilities have proven and are making money on to help you get the electricity-saving devices, the super-efficient lights, motors, appliances, windows, and so on. So then you won't need as much electricity to do the same jobs. Then the utility can burn less coal and emit less sulfur, but the main effect is the utility is going to save a big pot of money because efficiency costs less than coal. Then you can use some of the money they save to clean up the remaining power plants and the rest to lower the rates. So again, everybody wins.
Green plants, all green plants, and especially trees, take a great deal of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere every day. One of the ways many scientists are now working on is finding other ways to take carbon dioxide out of the air and bury it in the earth or in the oceans. Some even point out that the Earth as a whole is homeostatic. That is, whenever one substance, like carbon dioxide, increases in the atmosphere, nature herself will respond to reduce that substance. The tropical rainforests are an example of forest influencing climate. Dr. Thomas Lovejoy, biologist and researcher at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., explains some of the connections.
Well, there are 2 or 3 reasons to be concerned about what's happening in the tropical rainforest. First and foremost is that somewhere between 50 and 90% of all species of plant and animal life occur in those forests. So as they're destroyed, species are being lost. And that's a matter of great concern for a whole bunch of reasons that one worries about species by species. But these forests are important from other aspects as well. One, they're involved with regional climate. For example, the Amazon rainforest literally makes half of its own rainfall, so it's responsible for regional, maybe even continental climate. And lastly, tropical forests hold an enormous pool of carbon. So as they're cut and they're burned, they're adding to the accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere and the problems of the increased greenhouse effect.
Not all environmentalists agree with Jeremy Rifkin that we need to cut back on our rich lifestyles by using fewer resources and adopting a green lifestyle. Here's the way Jack Barkenbus, director of the Environmental Studies Institute at the University of Tennessee, reacted to the global warming scenarios.
Say something about global warming. We've had a very pleasant spring here in East Tennessee. It came early. Everyone's enjoying it. Temperatures have been 10 to 20 degrees warmer in many cases than normal. You have not heard anything about a greenhouse effect. But had these temperatures been 10 to 20 degrees warmer in the summertime, everyone would be talking about the greenhouse effect. And so what they do is they associate warming, or global warming, with bad events, with unfortunate events. The thing about the climate change issue is that some people will benefit from it. Some of our northern neighbors will benefit from having warmer temperatures. The Canadians, the Soviets presumably will benefit. And so that's why it's going to be a difficult issue to deal with internationally, because some may see that they're going to gain from it. And it's not necessarily that everyone will suffer. So even though the thrust of the concern in this country is that it's an unmitigated evil, it may be difficult to convince the international community of that. How you stand on the global warming question is essentially how satisfied you are with today's society. If you think that we're not doing enough for the environment or for energy, generally those people think we should move right away because they have other agendas. They've been pushing these agendas for many years, and global warming is just another occasion to push that.
Some say if we burn the coal and oil and gas, we get global warming. But if we don't burn the coal, oil, and gas, we cannot support our high standard of living. Well, what can we do? Can we get both? Physicist and engineer Ken Zweibel at the Solar Energy Research Institute in Golden, Colorado, sees one way out of the energy environment dilemma.
Well, clearly one of the great excitements about photovoltaics has always been that it uses no fuel. Essentially, it sits outside and uses sunlight, and it does not produce any pollution. It doesn't produce the familiar smoke and waste products that we're used to from other technologies. And from the standpoint of more recent concerns, such as the greenhouse effect, it obviously does not produce any CO2. So it is one of the major alternatives for producing a lot of electricity without polluting the environment. In fact, to quantify it somewhat, a recent study was done in Germany where they're very seriously considering photovoltaics and increasing their federal support, that compared photovoltaics to conventional energy sources on to produce basically a monetization of how much it costs environmentally to use conventional electricity. And what it showed was that conventional electricity costs about twice as much in environmental impact as we actually pay, and that those costs are not in the bills that consumers pay for their electricity. If that was added to those costs for conventional electricity, photovoltaics would be very close to being competitive right now with, for instance, the Arco Solar progress.
Well, can solar energy help all the world to higher standards of living?
One of the critical things about the third world is that most of the villages do not have electricity. For instance, I've heard that in India there are 500,000 villages that are not grid connected. And those are all very fertile field for photovoltaics. And essentially what you would have there is if you could have economic photovoltaics, what you would have there is an option that these people could use without the very high costs of connecting to the grid and without adding to pollution. Because one of the great additions to the greenhouse effect is going to come from the third world as they start to electrify those villages and that do not have electricity right now. And they're either going to use conventional fossil fuels like coal, or they're going to have some option like photovoltaics that doesn't add to the greenhouse effect.
Well, do we have to change our lifestyle and consume less?
I think it's a pleasure to participate in the United States high standard of living. I certainly wouldn't want to give up the things that I've become accustomed to and that my two children have also become accustomed to. I don't want photovoltaics or any alternative energy to be looked on as a high-cost option that destroys the standard of living that we've become used to. We're attempting to make photovoltaics inexpensive. In fact, we think photovoltaics can drop in cost in the 21st century. There are not many options for making electricity that can make that claim. I'm excited about that, and I'm not excited about reducing our standard of living.
Almost all experts agree that energy is a key to wealth and progress in both the first and the third world. But how to provide that energy with the least risk of pollution and of possible global warming is subject to debate. Solar cells and windmills can help, but they only work when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing. How can we provide a reliable energy production base without adding to the greenhouse effect? One of the most promising, but also one of the most controversial proposals in the early 21st century is to expand the use of nuclear power. Dr. Bernard Cohen, physicist and radiation expert at the University of Pittsburgh, thinks the recent concern with global warming may open the way to expanded use of nuclear energy for producing electricity.
Well, there's certainly hope that it might. I mean, certainly the environmental groups, who are very influential in convincing the media what to publicize, and which does most of the direction of what the government does. The environmental groups now seem to be more concerned about the dangers of greenhouse effect and acid rain and air pollution also, finally they're waking up to, than they are about the dangers of nuclear power. This is a very hopeful sign. I mean, nuclear power, of course, completely avoids greenhouse effect and completely avoids acid rain and completely avoids air pollution.
But what about the risks? Many people think nuclear power plants are too dangerous.
Well, the dangers of any technology are relative. It's possible on an average that nuclear power may eventually cause
the deaths of perhaps 10 people a year in the United States. On the other hand, the principal alternative to nuclear power would be burning coal. And if you produce the same amount of electricity by burning coal, you would be killing tens of thousands of people per year in the United States. Another alternative would be to go without electricity, but this is also a very dangerous alternative. That way, you reducing lighting on the roads increases the number of accidents. Reduced lighting would cause more murders. There are all sorts of ways in which overzealous conservation can kill people. And in fact, the most dangerous thing is that if it stunts our economic growth, leading to unemployment, and unemployment is by far the greatest threat that our society faces. Each 1% increase in unemployment kills several tens of thousands of people per year through various methods. So compared to any of the alternatives, nuclear power is very, very safe.
As you can see, there is much disagreement about global warming. If there is such a thing as a middle ground, perhaps it is that of the late Marion Clausen, agricultural economist and forestry expert at the Resources for the Future in Washington, D.C.
In the first place, there's been a great deal of exaggeration about whether warming has taken place up till now. Depends on what source of data you use, depends on what period of time you use, and so on. And most of the models that predict future warming, if you apply them to the past, when we've had admittedly an increased CO2 concentration, we should have had a marked warming, and it hasn't occurred. Now, it raises all kinds of questions in my mind about how much global warming we are likely to have. And I think two things follow from that. One is that we should continue to monitor it as carefully as we can, to study it, to develop new models, to be eclectic in our approach, quantitative and questioning, and not start with the assumption that there's going to be global warming, but challenge it and so on. It's going to take some time to be sure what's happening. And I mean, a matter of a good many years. I don't expect to be here to see any definitive conclusions on the matter. If there is going to be serious global warming, then the question comes, what effects will it have? Now, no doubt, some of the effects will be favorable. On balance, they'll probably be unfavorable. And, there was a time when the predictions were made that the ocean level would rise 30 or 40 feet. Now it's been shrunk to about 10% of that. How much will it rise? What can we do about it? How serious is it? Does it take place? How rapidly does it take place? How reversible is it? I don't know, and I think my point is the jury is out on all of these questions. That's where I come out.
Well, the jury may be out for Marion Clausen and other scientists, but the world jury of more than 60 nations met in Kyoto, Japan in December of 1997, and they did make some decisions about global warming. In a conference sponsored by the United Nations, politicians, scientists, and government officials, including the then Vice President of the United States, Al Gore, signed the Kyoto Agreement to take specific steps that they hoped would prevent or at least minimize global warming. The United States and other industrialized nations committed themselves to reducing carbon dioxide emissions by 6 to 7% below 1990 levels as a beginning step. Developing nations like India and China, however, did not commit to this goal. The treaty was never submitted for ratification by the United States Senate, and the United States withdrew from the Kyoto process altogether in the first decade of the 21st century. Nations that did sign and ratify the treaty are preparing for another conference in 2010 to work on a second and more restrictive version. Most of the earlier targets have not been met, however, so the future of global warming, both scientifically and socially, is cloudy.